Hey everybody, this is Denver Dano, aka Denver Dano. Shout out to everybody in Robot, everybody in Obot. So I've been asked to do a video just to show how I do endless dungeons as Realmshifter, particularly with a focus on trying to maximize the orn gains that you get when you're doing that. So I think in this one I'm going to focus on how to sort of prep the dungeons, get them all ready, get all the buffs up, everything, and just talk about a few sort of general points. So I guess the first thing that I want to mention is anytime you're playing specifically to gather orns in Orna, you have to remember that there are a number of sort of boosts you can get that are going to increase the orns that you pick up when you're fighting mobs. So these can be like, there's certain types of equipment you can put on that are going to increase your orn gains. There are certain consumable items. There are events in the game. There are quests that you can do now that increase your orn gains. And with all these different boosts, they stack and they're multiplicative. So that means if you have something that's giving you a 50% boost that you've equipped and something else that's giving you another 50% boost, you would multiply those together. 1.5 times 1.5 gives you a total boost of 2.25. So I've kind of worked out what those sort of boosts look like when you stack them all together. And you can actually end up getting boosts that are sort of in like the 130s, 140s, 150s if you've got a reasonable set of gear. So the total boost that I end up with if I'm running gauntlets with all my equipment on, with all the consumables, temples, everything, is about 164. So if you think about fighting a mob that normally drops you 700 orns, you've got those multipliers on, it's now dropping over 100,000 orns for you, about 115,000. So you can see how that very, very quickly adds up. And then when you're doing endless dungeons as well, the monsters are slowly getting more difficult, but at the same time, they are dropping more orns as you go. So just bear that in mind. We're trying to stack as many multipliers together as possible. Second thing I want to mention is when you're doing endless dungeons, when you're starting out and you're prepping all the dungeons, you just want to put as many buffs on your character as possible. When you're playing as Realmshifter base or Corvus, you don't have to worry about Berserk killing you, which is a huge bonus. So you can have a good number of buffs on there when you're going into the dungeons. So we want to try and get as many of those on as possible. Also when you're starting, you want to think about how many dungeons do you want to prep and do at one time. So because there is a bit of time involved in prepping everything, it usually makes it a little bit more efficient, more worth your while to do 3 or 4 or 5 dungeons at the same time. So for these steps that I'm going to show you, you would have to apply these to each dungeon that you want to do in your run. So with all that being said, let's just go ahead and dive into the steps. So the first thing that I want to do is we're actually going to start as Beowulf class. And we are going to start with the Berserker spec. So equipping these is going to allow me to get 3 valuable buffs. The Berserker spec is going to let me get Berserk 1, Berserk 2, and Beowulf spec is going to let me get Call of Bernhild. You know what, actually, I'm just going to do this in my first dungeon, save us a few taps. So regarding the loadout that you have for Beowulf, I really don't bother with this too much. You can change it around. The key thing is you don't want to be suffering from dots that are going to slow you down at all. So I've got some gear on that's going to prevent different dots. So Beguile Mystic Catar is going to prevent me from getting, stunned, rot, frozen, or on fire, I guess. Briny Pendant is going to stop me from having blight or toxic, I think, and poison. And the Reach of Charm is going to stop me from being petrified. I put the Fortitude Amity on just so that you start with a few ward turns. Probably don't need it, to be honest, but it's just a little bit of extra safety. And then in terms of the skill loadout, I haven't really bothered optimizing this, But the important things to have at this stage is going to be Call of Burnhild, which I have down at the very, very bottom, Berserk 1 and Berserk 2. If you don't have Call of Burnhild 2, I think Call of Burnhild 1 works fairly well. Obviously, 2 is better. I think it just has a slightly better proc rate. But anyway, that's the one I've got, so that's what I go with. In terms of pet at this stage, I go with Steward Golem, and that's because Steward Golem is going to give me the elemental resistances, and it's also going to help me build up my ward. If you don't have Steward Golem, I think you can start with Ortonite Golem, which will give you the resistances as well, but maybe it doesn't. Anyway, you want a pet that's going to give you the elemental resistances. I think one of the Yetis will do it as well. If you've got Steward Golem, that's the best because it can give you all of them in one go. So let's go ahead and start this first dungeon. Okay, so I'm literally just going to Burnhild, Berserk 1, Berserk 2. Now I'm going to exit. And you can see that my pet has already given me the elemental defenses as well, which is good. And he's starting to help me build up my ward turns. So I'm going to exit. If you were doing 4 or 5, however many dungeons, you would go through that step for each of the dungeons that you're doing. But I'm just going to do one for now. Next step is going to be to change our class to Realmshifter. This is going to let us get the bulk of our buffs. We're going to change our spec to Raider. I appreciate some people are probably thinking that I'm spending a lot of orns spec swapping, which is true, but I am confident that the orns that you get back from being able to go further in the dungeon definitely outweigh anything that you're paying to do this. Cool. So I've got Raider, Realmshifter. I'm keeping the same pet in because I want to build up those war turns. And I have a special loadout, which is literally just for buffing. So this is made to basically prevent as many debuffs or statuses as possible. So the Crystallis that I have, I think, prevents me from having my damage, my attack reduced, and having my defense and resistance reduced as well. I've got Book of the Dragon, which is going to give me a dragon alignment, and I have a dragon enchantment on my weapon that I use as well. If you don't have dragon stuff, you can also use earth, which I think works pretty well, but dragon is best because I think it's got the fewest number of mobs that are either immune to it or resistant to it, and it's just generally a strong one. So that's just one to consider. Like I said, use earth if you haven't got that. Again, I've got the fortitude amity. I think that's a little bit redundant at this point, but for the buff stage, I don't think it's worth really messing with that too much. Ring of Anwin is just going to give me those basic elemental status immunities. And then Briny Pendant, again, going to prevent blight. The key thing is at this stage, you don't want to have status immunities sort of slowing you down because you just want to get these buffs up as fast as possible. So if we drop back in, actually I forgot to go through my skill set, so I'll just go through those quickly now. We've got Divine Bastion, which is going to increase our ward absorption to 100%. So depending on the mob that I'm facing, I might do that one right off the bat, or I might get some defensive buffs up first. I'm not worried about this guy, so I'm going to go ahead and use that one straight away. Now my ward absorption, if we check, is up to 100%. So when I get down to red line and I've only got 1 HP, I don't have to worry about anything killing me other than dots. You always got to watch out for dots. Dot being damage over time. Okay, so now I'm just going to start going through all the different buffs. So first one I'm going to apply is Berserk 3. I like to get that one up first because obviously it buffs everything, which means that if I'm in a situation where I want to kill the mob I'm fighting and move on to one that's easier to allow me to get my buffs up, I've already got the damage increase as well as the defense benefits, all that stuff. Then I'm going to start going into my defensive buffs. So Golem's Fortitude, give me defense and resistance. And then Barrier 2 is also going to give me defense and resistance. You can see that my Dragon alignment popped on that turn as well. That one, to be honest, can be a bit of a pain sometimes. So I'm glad that it's at least out of the way. Okay. We're going to use Warcry to get the basic attack up. And we're going to use Bear's Might. So usually with Bear's Might, you would get the defensive debuffs and resistance debuffs. But because of the weapon that I'm carrying, it prevents me from getting those. So it just removes a step out of the whole buffing stage. Next, this build that I'm going to be using, which we'll go through in a second, is a 100% crit build, which means that every time I hit the attack button, basically, I'm going to get a critical hit unless I miss. But the way to get that build up to 100% is to actually use the crit buff. So I use Worm Song. You can see that's giving me the crit. Sometimes it gives you dexterity, but in this case it hasn't. So I'm just going to go into my items and use a speed tonic. That's going to give me dexterity as well. And let me just count through these really quick and make sure that I've got all the buffs. So usually I'm looking for 5 buffs between the Zerks and the attacks, crit, 2 defensive buffs, 2 resistance buffs, Dragon alignment, Call of Burnhild for elemental resistances. I think, actually, I forgot to mention the purpose behind using Burnhild. That increases your pet's chance to cast a buff on you, which later on becomes important when we're swapping out. We're using Ashen Phoenix, so we can get the Daephic channel as often as possible. I personally don't use Gate of Gunner because the damage that you're going to be doing to the mobs for the most part is way more than you need to kill them until you get to the very end stage. But the resistance debuff that you take is so significant. I think it cuts it by like 90%. So you're lifting your damage ceiling way above what you need to kill the mobs, which doesn't help you, but then you're got this huge liability to any mobs that are using magic-based attacks. So I might use that at the very, very end of a run if it looks like I'm getting close to dying anyway, just to see if I can basically blast through a few more mobs. But those are all of the buffs that I need. So again, if you're doing 4 or 5 dungeons, you're going to go through every single one and put all these buffs up. And I guess it's worth mentioning as well, you can probably see when I exit now, I look at the timer on this dungeon. Because I had my unfilled Concords on, and there is a spelunking event on at the moment, I've only got 52 minutes left. So if I was trying to do this over 4 or 5 dungeons, the other ones I think would start with a couple of hours, so a little bit more time. But it gets kind of tight, so you might want to consider taking those Concords off just to give yourself a little bit more time to do all this. And sometimes, you know, if you're doing 5 dungeons, you can get a little bit worn out. So it's nice to be able to take a break, come back to it a few hours later and finish it up. Okay, so we've got all of our buffs up. Now we're going to swap our setup, and this is my Orn boosting setup. So I've got a Lost Helmet, which is adorned with Ashen Pinions. Got Court Jester's outfit, again with the Ashen Pinions. The Riff Rogue boots, I think I've got 1 Ashen Pinion to get me up to the crit number that I need. And then I've got a Trialing Bow, which is full of crit adornments. So the helmet, the weapon, and the chest piece all increase the orns that I'm getting. And I think they're like between 55 and 65% each. So you're multiplying all those together. As far as I know, there's not any boots in the game that increase your orn gains, which is why for Realmshifters, trying to get a really good set of Arisen Rift Rogue boots was such a big deal during the recent event, because you don't have to worry about putting in a weak piece of armor to boost your orns. So you just want basically the best piece that you can get here to help with your survivability. I've got 2 bogs in. So the famed bog, I think, gives me 72.5% boost, and the superior gives me 65% boost. Multiplying those together. And I also need to change my spec now. So we are going to swap back to Oracle. This allows us to equip 2 amenities. And the amenities that I want are my ancillary amenities. And all that these do is boost the effectiveness of the accessories that you have. And because my accessories are boosting the orn gains, that means that these effectively become an additional 25% boost each to the overall orn total that I'm getting. So when you put those two together, I think it's like a 56% bonus that I'm getting. So that's all helping me reach the maximum orn multiplier. At this stage as well, I would then go. Actually, no. I was going to say I would start putting all of my consumables and everything on, which is not entirely true. But I would put a few of my consumables on. So Lucky Coin, I think, boosts experience. Lucky Silver Coin boosts my orns. Experience Potion, which doesn't matter for me because I'm 250, but if I've got other people in the party who are not, help them get a little bit of extra experience. And I'm going to use Dowsing Rod as well, which helps me find more items. Because particularly for gauntlet keys, if I'm coming across mobs that drop them, I want the best chance possible that I'm actually going to get them. And now that I've got all those buffs up, I'm basically into starting to beat up the mobs. So this early part of the dungeon, the focus for me is going to be just building up as many war turns as possible without really putting myself at risk. So you can, at this stage, use Bloodshift. And what Bloodshift does is, if you land a critical attack, it prevents your HP from regaining, which is valuable because it means you're not taking yourself out of redline, so you're still getting the redline boosts. The other cool thing about it is it still allows you to regain mana when you're doing that. For me personally, I don't really bother trying to juggle Bloodshift, until I'm a little bit later in the dungeon. So for these early parts, I'm basically going to be using Guarding Strikes to help get my ward up as high as possible, and going back and forth between that and just basic attacks, which are going to help my my MP balance stay high enough to carry on. And that is basically this portion of the dungeon. One thing I want to point out is obviously I'm Ascension level 51, so if you're coming into this, with no Ascensions or low Ascension levels, your performance is going to look quite different to mine. But I think the fundamentals kind of stay the same. One thing I want to mention with this loadout, and this is a good example here, is that you are going to come across mobs who have dragon immunity or resistance. So in that case, I usually keep Earth Strike in my loadout, and I'm going to go ahead and just hit him with Earth Strike. And I guess actually this is a good time just to talk about the skills that I've got in this loadout as well. So I haven't really optimized this fully, to be honest, because I don't think there's a full loadout of skills that I really need. But the important ones are going to be Guarding Strike, which allows me to kill mobs. It's a good high penetration attack, and it's also going to help me to recover my keep my ward turns high. Ward of Ortonite, basically use that if my ward starts dropping later on in the dungeon, especially if I don't have the Ortonite Golem in anymore. We've got Stun Dart and Sleep Dart, which can be really, really valuable if you are struggling at some point. You need to either refill your mana or refill some of your ward. But just bear in mind, if you're using the Assassin spec, then you've basically got a 100% chance that those are going to hit any mobs who are not immune to them. But because we're not using that, we're using the Oracle spec, it's not going to hit every single time. So you still have to be a little bit careful when you're using those. But those can be valuable just to give you a little breather, like I said, to replenish your MP, or your ward if you need to. Earth Strike is going to be really, really valuable against any mobs who are dragon resistant or dragon immune. I've got Wisp Heal to take care of any the elemental status effects. You can also use Cure All. I prefer to use Wisp Heal because I think Cure Alls are kind of hard to find, and especially if you're doing endless dungeons, you can easily go through 15 or 20 of them. So your stash will drop pretty fast. So if I can get away with it, I'll use Wisp Heal. But just remember, if you've got Burn and Paralyze on you at the same time, there's a chance that Wisp Heal won't actually proc in that case because of the paralysis, in which case the damage from the burn will kill you. So in those cases, you're probably better off using the Cure All. Cure Bleeding, again, if someone casts Bleed on you, I'd rather use that than waste a Cure All if it's all possible. Realm Strikes and Sortie I would never use, really. If I was going to use one of those two, it would probably be Sortie because it's got a higher penetration value, even though it does lower overall damage. But as you start to progress and mobs get more difficult, Realm Strikes will just get zeroed out, which is why I've put together a build that's basically 100% crit, so I can just keep using the attack button. And that's going to go a long way, especially with all the buffs that I've got in sort of clearing out these mobs. Other thing I would point out at the moment is if you've got Corvus unlocked, you could go ahead and swap to Corvus at this point. I personally don't, because I like having recharge, so it just allows me to move through the dungeon a little bit faster, because when my mana starts dropping, just have to do a basic attack and that refills it. So at this point, I'm basically just trying to get through levels as quickly as possible. And how far you want to go, I think, depends on how far you think you can get and basically how strong you are. So I can usually get into the high 200s in terms of floors in the dungeon pretty easily. And it's not uncommon for me to get into like the mid 300s or even kind of the high 300s. So with that in mind, if I'm doing 4 or 5 dungeons, it's the most valuable portion of it is going to be those higher levels. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just, in each of the dungeons that I'm running, I'm just going to try and get to level, for me, at least level 150, probably closer to 180. But if you're in a position where you're getting to level 150 or level 200, you might want to be going to, I don't know, 80, 90, 100, depending on how many dungeons you want to do. And how far you think you can get. And that is pretty much it. So then once you've got all your dungeons prepped, you're at the right level you want to be at before you really want to start maximizing your orn gains. Then basically you're going to jump back out and you're going to hit all of your consumables and buffs this time. So I would recommend using Vulcan's Brew because I think that gives you 20% Orn gain. Obviously, the coins are really, really easy, so just go ahead and use both of those. If you still need experience, use your experience. If you need the Dowsing Rod, go ahead and use that. If there is a shrine nearby, grab that because that's going to double your Orns. If not, you can buy them from the rune shop. I think they're about $1 or whatever the equivalent is in your local currency. I know in England they're like 70p, something like that. If the kingdom is running temples, that's going to give you another 1.2. And if there is an Orn event like Spelunking or just the Orn event, it's either like another 25% or 20% bonus. So ideally, you want to do all this when the temples are up and there's an event going on. And just to kind of, I guess, express the magnitude of that. The Orn boost that I'm getting at the moment is about 164 when I've got all of the boosts available up. But if there's no temple and there's no event going on, that drops down to about 109. So you can see it makes a pretty radical difference because all these things are multiplicative. And I would also use the bestial potions as well, but only if there's sort of temples, events, all that stuff going on. Same thing with the Vulcan's brew. I'm only going to use that if there's events, because it's just not worth it if you're not getting those extra boosts as well, in my opinion. Um, and then yeah, and then when you get to the end stage, for me, when I get to level about 100, I'm gonna switch over to Corvus. So I'll show you. Obviously, I'm not at level 100 in this dungeon yet, but switch over to Corvus, and basically, at that point, I'm just gonna start spamming the attack button, and you just want to move it through it as quickly as possible. But bear in mind, as you get a little bit later on and the mobs start getting stronger, if you miss an attack or you hit a mob who's immune to whatever alignment you have, that can be really dangerous if they're going to turn around and kill you. So usually the mobs that are going to end your run is going to be a heretic, especially if you've got gated gunner. They're really, really dangerous, but they can cast status effects on you as well. Because now we've taken those briny pendants, the ring of Anwin, all that stuff off. We're now susceptible to those. The other thing that's a bit painful about heretic is just the fact that they have second chance. So even if you pop them for a good amount of damage, they can still sometimes come back and hit you. Fallen Bayo is really, really dangerous because they can hit you for a ton of damage, and they are dragon immune. So you can use Earth Strikes. And then the other big one, I think that catches everybody, is Realmshifter. So if you come across a fallen Realmshifter, the first thing I try and do is they're not so dangerous when they're at full HP, but it's as their HP starts dropping that they get really, really dangerous. So the first thing I'm going to do when I come across one is try to stun it when it's not as dangerous, and then you just start attacking and pray that it stays stunned the whole time. Because if it's not, it's going to get really hard to hit, and they're capable of just killing you in one go. See, I wasn't paying attention there, and I just put Earth Attack, which I don't want when I was actually trying to just use Earth Strike. Let me just attack him. Now I need to drop out and put no affinity on and just remove that because that's not what I need. In fact, have I got my Orn booster set up on? Okay. Cool. Get rid of that Earth Attack. And just carry on. So now that I'm Corvus, I'm not getting the recharge when I'm landing these critical hits, which means at some point I will need to replenish my mana. But at the same time, because I'm just using attacks, it's not really a huge issue for the most part. But you will get to a stage where mobs start becoming more difficult. You have to use actual skills to kill them rather than just spamming the attack button. And this is pretty much it. Now it's just a matter of going as far as you can get. And because you've got the shrine that's ticking down, you want to just be getting through as many as possible. I think some people have raised the question about whether or not you should be swapping your gear out if you get to a really difficult mob when you've got the shrine ticking, or if you should just be sort of plowing through it. My take on that is it kind of depends. If I'm at a high level and there's a mob that I might not be able to kill anyway, I know that I've got 4 other dungeons that are prepped, I'm probably not going to swap out. But at the same time, if I only got 1 or 2 dungeons left and I've got 40 minutes left on my shrine, I know that I've got plenty of time. And I know that it takes a long time to get a dungeon prepped to the point that you're getting the big gains. So if that were the case, I would actually start swapping gear in and out, potentially even spec swapping, but not always. Yep. And then you can, at some points, swap in the Phoenix whenever you feel like you've got a good ward balance and you feel like you would benefit from that Deific channel. Again, if you've used the bestial potions, that's going to help it to proc more often. You don't necessarily, it's tricky because sometimes Deific channel will drop, and if it does that during a particularly strong mob, that can be a problem. But at the same time, it will also help you just get through mobs pretty quickly. And that's basically it. So I don't think we're going to see any big orn gains in this video. You kind of have to get up into the 200s to start getting, for me, I can get 5, 6, 7 million if I find the right mob. But even just the gains that I'm getting at the moment, that's 200,000. That's without having the daily Orn bonus, without having Vulcan, without having a shrine, without having triple temple. So you can imagine what those numbers would look like if we had all those. And yes, that's pretty much it. I think maybe the last thing I would mention quickly is just some of the gear choices that you have, because you may not have a trialing bow, for example. So if you don't have a trialing bow, the next best thing is going to be to dual wield questing bows. I prefer the trialing bow because I think it's a little bit stronger, it has more ward, and I think actually you can get better orange from it, and you certainly get higher crit value. I think with trialing bow, because it's got 10 slots, you can get a crit bonus of 40%. Whereas if you're dual wielding questing bows, when you dual wield something, it takes a 65% penalty, which means that the max crit that you can get if you've got both bows fully adorned is like 26. So the trialing bow is going to help me get to that number a little bit easier. I think a lot of people use the Mightiest Mimic Head, which you might want to think about using. I've never used it myself. I've been happy with the Lost Tome, so wouldn't stress about it too much. And then Court Jester's outfit is kind of the go-to for a chess piece in terms of gaining your orns. If you're getting to the very end, like I said, if it's sort of your last dungeon and you're just really struggling, it might be worth just swapping out maybe the chess piece for a stronger piece of armor. You're going to massively reduce the orn gains that you're getting. But if it means that you can carry on for another 20, 30 floors, that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise, then it might be worth it. But you kind of have to make those decisions on the margin. So I hope that's helpful for everybody. As always, you're more than welcome to ask me any questions if you've got them. And if everybody wants, I can do a sort of like late stage dungeon video just to show you what it starts to look like when you get further on and some of the things to look out for. But that one will be for another day. So anyway, like I said, hope this was helpful. Thanks for your time, and maybe we'll see each other again soon.